So today I'm here to present you with my top 10 essential horror books that I would recommend to anyone looking to get their foundations in this genre. Before we get started, I do want to give the usual disclaimers that of course this video is not meant to be gatekeeping, so if you haven't read these books or aren't interested in reading them, you can still be a true horror fan, and I'm only going to include one book per author, so before you yell at me why there is not 10 Stephen King books on this list, know I'm going into it with that guideline. And of course, while I'm presenting this as an objective list, I realize that a video like this, a list like this, is going to be really subjective based off my reading experience and tastes and opinions. So if you disagree with me, that's okay. Let's have a discussion down in the comments down below. All that being said, let's get started. First, I'm going to go back to the 1800s. I'm going to do this list in chronological order, starting with Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, for the most part, I'm going to try to focus on novels in this list, but I do recognize that Edgar Allan Poe is just too iconic, so I had to include one of his short stories. And in my mind, Telltale Heart is the most iconic, the one that is often referenced the most. If you don't know, this story follows a narrator who has just committed a murder and then is trying to convince us as the reader of their sanity and justifying why they did it. This is a story that in many ways is told over and over again, not just in horror, but you'll see the same kind of narrative done in thrillers. Again, looking at the age of when this is written, it feels very modern and progressive in its ideas. I think Edgar Allan Poe, I don't think anyone's going to give me a lot of kickback in general for putting this author on the list, but certainly there's a lot of really iconic stories, and I think that there's a lot of argument to be made for different ones, but I love this one. I think it is just, again, something that is referenced and nodded to in so many other works later on, so if you haven't gone back to the beginning, I really recommend doing so. This author reads incredibly modern despite the time that it was written. I think that is something that just needs to be on everyone's essential list, whether you read in school or afterwards, it just needs to be done. Moving on, we have Dracula by Bram Stoker, and I don't think this one's going to get a lot of kickback on this list. I think most people understand why it's there. It's a very iconic story that introduces the character of Dracula, who is told again and again in different films and retold in many stories. It is not the first story to have a vampire in it, so it didn't create the concept of vampires, but definitely popularized it and really again pushed it into modern pop culture. And I think for a lot of us, we have seen a film or different adaptations and so forth that reference Dracula, so I do think it's really important to understand the original work. This story is told through letters and we get to see the surrounding characters, and I actually found it really interesting when I read it at the beginning because I went into it with the assumption that a lot of the iconic tropes surrounding vampires were created afterwards, but so many of those original elements are in that story, and so you get to see how they play out and again are retold over and over again through different forms, and I love how that is done. And I think it's just a really important story. Compared to some of the other classics on this list, I do feel like the writing in Dracula is very consumable and feels relatively contemporary. And so I do recommend it. It's an easy one to get into, a story that you really should read, even if you're someone like myself who doesn't always love vampire stories. This is one you gotta read if you want to understand where it all started. Next is The Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft, and this is another short story on this list, but again, one that I had to include because Lovecraft is so influential within horror genre today. This is a story that I personally would recommend beginning with because I think it really introduces a lot of the classic tropes that you see when someone describes something as being cosmic or Lovecraftian. Often, in my mind, they are really referencing back to this story. Of course, you see it again and again as different ones, but this one has the monster, the tentacles, that cosmic, epic feeling to it. And I really think that it captures the essence of the author's work in a very palatable form. It's again a short story, so it's easy to fly through, and I do think that you need to understand it. Personally, I spent way too much time reading modern cosmic horror and other Lovecraftian works that reference to this classic without actually knowing what it was all about. So I'm glad that I finally went back and had that experience because since then I've had a much greater appreciation for what cosmic horror is trying to do. While it's not a personal favorite genre of mine, it's one that you just have to understand what you're getting yourself into. Those words are thrown around so often, and compared to some other genres within horror, I think that you kind of need to read it to know what people talk about when they call something cosmic, something Lovecraftian. And so in my mind, this is the right short story to get you started in that regard. Next, let's talk about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And this is a gothic thriller horror that follows a woman who meets a man. He is a widower, and they quickly court and go on and proceed to get married, and then he whisks her off to his mansion of Manderley. There, she starts to learn more about his previous wife, Rebecca, and starts to wonder what actually happened with her, and also wondering perhaps is her husband still in love with her and all of that. This is one that is not only influential for horror, but I could argue would also be influential in thrillers, and so I could have included that on that list, but I think there's enough crossover and I felt that it worked here. But certainly this in my mind is the foundations of domestic thrillers, but also the domestic horror and gothic story that we see told over and over again. This is another time where I'd read a lot of gothic fiction up to this point, or particularly modern gothic, and I didn't really have a full appreciation for it until I went back to the classic. This again is a classic that in my mind is very accessible. I am someone who does have a tendency, as you can kind of tell from this video, for modern language, but this one was so readable and I just found myself guessing and second guessing myself and wondering what was going on. Again, it felt like having that thriller experience where you're turning the pages and trying to predict what's going to happen next. There's a great feeling of suspense and atmosphere, and that I think is what the author does so well. This is a book that I definitely waited too long to read, because before reading this, I read several books that were described as an homage or reference to Rebecca. And again, I read those first, and I don't think I fully appreciated what those other authors were trying to do because I didn't really fully understand what the original work was doing. I think this one is brilliant. It's a personal favorite of mine. Highly recommend it. If you want to explore Gothic fiction at its roots, this is a fantastic place to go. Next, I want to talk about The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And this, of course, is a story of a group of investigators who go into a supposedly haunted house to figure out what is going on. This is a book I put in as replacement for Hell House, again, following my one book per author. Personally, I actually prefer this over Hell House just because I find the characters to be a little bit stronger, but I'm sure I'm going to create some disagreement by just saying that. This story in my mind is very cozy in nature. It's the kind of horror story that is very reminiscent of the time it was written, where it is much more about suspense and feeling and atmosphere rather than a lot of horrifying dark things happening. It takes quite a while within the story before things start to get going. And again, compared to a lot of really popular modern books, the stakes and the darkness of this book don't feel as serious or as demonic as other books and stories will go. But I think that this one is great. With haunted houses, there are kind of two different narratives that you see. You have either the family moving into a house and ending up turning out to be haunted, they can't financially leave, etc., and goes down that route. And then you have books like this that help to create the other kind of haunted house story where you have investigators where the house is presumably also already known to be haunted and they're just trying to go in and prove it. I like that this book has a cast of characters where there are believers and skeptics, and you get to see how their positions and opinions change as the story progresses. I think it's just very well done, and I'll be honest, I really want to include Shirley Jackson on this list. I feel that they are a classic author for a reason. I think that they do great things within the genre, and I really love their work. This one I think is their most influential, especially if they're long fiction, but again, if you disagree, let me know. Next is Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, and this is a classic coming-of-age story by an author that I really adore. They are a classic author of not just writing horror, but also science fiction. And in this one, we follow young boys who are recounting this experience they had in the fall. There is possibly some wicked entity that has entered their town. There is a carnival coming in. And it's really a story of these two young boys growing up. And a major aspect of the story is their relationship with the one boy's father. And they're just dealing with changes and all of the intricacies of being a young boy at that point in time. This book I want to put on this list as the essential recommendation for where to start with a classic coming-of-age narrative. For me, this book is very light in terms of the actual horror elements. It's more suspenseful than, again, the outright horrors you get with other books I'm going to mention here. But in my mind, I can't not recommend a coming-of-age story because it has become so interwoven with the horror narrative. You see an interlacing of these two genres over and over again in many books that, again, I'm actually going to talk about again on this list. And in my mind, this is really the roots of it. It became a story that got pulled into into the horror genre, and the horror genre loved coming of age stories so much that we never let go of those narratives. And you'll see it again and again show up in modern books. It's a particular subgenre of horror that I've really grown to love. I love the nostalgia, the looking back, the end of innocence, and all those things that these books do. And this one does it very well. Moving on, let's talk about Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. And this, of course, is a well-known story that follows a couple who move into an apartment building. Soon enough, the woman becomes pregnant, and strange things start to happen. They have their neighbors dropping by who just seem very unusual and very involved in her pregnancy. This is a story I had the luck of going into completely blind. I read this book before seeing the movie, and because of that, I got to experience it with really fresh eyes. I absolutely stand by my opinion that this is an essential horror book. If you want to get familiar with the genre, you must read this one. I have read so many modern thriller and horror books that have clearly been an homage and a nod back to this classic. This is a book that was put out in a point of time where there was more access to different kinds of birth control. It was written right before the wake of different treatments and things that would come to pass, and really question a lot of our conversations around what it means to carry a child and who that child is. And it's just a really smart book. Absolute nightmare fuel if you are pregnant, so I always like to give that warning. I read this after I was pregnant, and I'm really grateful I waited. But if you haven't yet read this book, again, even if you're not really interested in pregnancy horror books, this is one you just need to read, because you will see this book nodded to in popular films, popular books, and once you know what those tropes are, you will see it again and again, done over and over again, but it all goes back to this one book. Then let's talk about The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. And this, of course, is an iconic possession story that follows a woman whose young daughter plays with a Ouija board. Something possibly happens, and then her daughter seems changed. She first goes to the scientific and medical community for answers, and when they can't offer any solutions, she then goes to the church. And with the help of priests, they go on to perform an exorcism. This is a highly popularized story. I suspect you've probably seen the movie, but I do stand by it that I think it is really worth going back to the source material. This is a story that really was revolutionary when it happened. I understand that the author wrote this. I hope this isn't a urban myth, but specifically as a callback to people to return back to church. The author themselves were religious. I grew up in a home that is very Catholic, and talking about possession and being careful about opening up your soul to allow a demon to come in was taught in the same way that everything else that was fact was taught. And so I found this book to be very disturbing. It is very much built around Catholic beliefs in a way that makes it very scary to those like myself that have that background. And I think that this book is, again, just so influential, really popularizing the possession genre that you would see, again, not only in books, but there are so many films that have come afterwards. And again, if you want to know where it all came from and want to see where those tropes started, you want to go back here and read this one. It holds up to modern day reading. It is so well done. One of the scariest books I've ever read. I will stand by that. And I really loved it. So I hope you will too. And again, even if possession horror is not your thing, if you want to know the foundations of where it started, this is where you go. And finally, my last essential book is It by Stephen King. So please, before you finish typing those hate comments, he is on this list. I definitely consider Stephen King to be one of the most influential authors, and so naturally one of his books had to make the list. The only question was which one. Certainly there are older Stephen King books that I could have chosen, but in my mind, it is one that is really revamped and reunited the excitement of the horror community. Once again, you have a group of boys who are fighting against the evil of this town. They have to do this in their youth and then come back and do it again as adults. And of course, there are many adaptations of it, but then you also see so many other books and movies that are clearly making nods that you have the group of boys fighting the generic evil, and you'll see that over and over again. And everyone really calls back to it. So of the books on this list, I will be honest, I actually had a different Stephen King book on my list earlier when I was making this, but I decided to go with this one. So if you disagree with me, that is okay. I want to discuss it in the comments. But for me, if I had to pick right now as I record this, I think it is the most influential. But certainly if I was allowed to put multiple Stephen Kings on this list, there would be multiple Stephen King books on this list, because his work has absolutely been very influential in both, again, books and movies. And you see so many other authors writing today based off their love of reading Stephen King as a teenager and a child. And I love to see that influence continue on. So that's my pick here. but it can be swayed, so let's talk about it. So that is it for this video here. I'd love to know of everything I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And again, while I'm presenting this as an objective list, please disagree with me in the comments. Let's start a conversation. So if you think that I horribly missed the mark on this one, if I missed an essential book that absolutely should be read by horror readers, drop a comment, let's discuss down below. If you're new to my channel and want to stick around, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, you can drop a comment. How about something that represents an emoji for a horror thing, so a ghost or a ghoul or a vampire? And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.